Ladies and gentlemen, so we have a work in progress here. Looks like it took a while for us to discuss the presentations, and I put together a summary of some of the issues that came up. Some of them overlap to what was said in the first presentation, and it should be so. I grouped them based on major issues. Some of the items are going to keep popping up between these several issues. I prepared a slide for each of the major issues, which I consider to be microstructure analysis, failure criteria, growth-induced oxide strains, properties and kinetics. So we group them in oxide kinetics and also void kinetics if you wish. We do need better correlations for exfoliated area fraction as a function of so-called parameters or variables, which we do not know what those might be now. Also, we established a need to consider multiple layered scales rather than one monolithic scale that has uniform properties throughout, and also to consider the variation of strains within each oxide scale. And that brings up to the last point, modeling of exfoliation of blockage. So the outcome of all of these, of the first six bullets would be a model for exfoliation and blockage. Few things that came up in the microstructure analysis, and I was trying to highlight them with bold, using a bold font. We envision maybe an atlas that will contain the micrographs that includes, multiple analysis of documentation of multiple layer oxides with the operating, plant data. We cannot use the data without the operating data because it's not going to be, we cannot use it for anything further on. We plan to go beyond 2D. So we got Rachel Thompson presented some good techniques, 3D techniques that can be used to image not only the morphologies of different structure that we see there, in the oxide scales, like cracks and voids. We can have an idea about the cavities which are present, the pore size and distribution. We plan to do it along the circumference of tubes, such that it's not going to be just one snapshot, it's going to be representative throughout. Of course, we have to use appropriate techniques, and it looks like there's a wealth of experience out there. We also, would like to establish, again, that atlas will also include also a database of morphologies, typical length scales that are important for understanding the defects and how the defects are affecting the exfoliation. We need to make sure Barry made a very interesting point that we need to use representative samples, and also from a point of that they are from adequate plant exposure, but also that they have relevant microstructures. And we have to make sure that the sample preparation doesn't introduce artifacts, doesn't create new voids and things like that. There was one interesting talk that dealt with the void defects. So it looks like there is a way to start understanding the void kinetics, and the atlas and the beyond 2D work will help shed light in connection to the modeling of this void growth and mitigation. Failure criteria. We need to update the so-called RV diagram. It's been leading us so far up to here, up to this point. It's been almost 40 years, and we need to come up with new concepts. Michael should have showed the fact that we cannot use just the critical strain as a function of oxide thickness. It needs to be another factor, and some of the one factor could be critical defect size or an effective defect size. We need to have an understanding about the defects, what is the maximum defect, what are the size distribution of the defects, because that will dictate how much mass will come off. And there are some other presentations of critical temperature drop, for example. People have used that in the past as a criteria. Turns out that's not enough. Same thing like a critical strain concept. And of course, we're looking for the last bullet here, dealing with the size of flakes. We need to have an idea, once these flakes are coming off, what's their size. If we can have a grip on the size distribution, will help us. Growth-induced oxide strains. Turns out that they are important. They have to be considered in analysis. And there are two kinds. Geometrically induced, because these oxides are growing into a tube that has a relatively small radius of curvature, if you wish. Also, Michael pointed out that steam exposure amplifies the intrinsic growth stresses as opposed to just air oxidation. Hugh Evans pointed out that there is a component of lateral oxide growth induced stresses, which in his opinion was about, from his analysis, was about 5%. In our opinion at WaterNL, that's significant. But we need to validate all of these formulations, all of these concepts that we are being proposed to take into account these growth-induced stresses. Brings me up to the next point. We need properties and kinetics. Maybe we may never be able to correlate lab scale, data with the plant data, but that's a wish list. It may be impossible, because so many things are very different between these two. I mean, the outcome is very different. But, lab scale data is so easy to obtain that it may be worth a shot at it. So again, I brought up the steam effects. We don't really know. Peter already mentioned, there was an effort at WaterNL. We don't really know why the steam oxidation is so different from air oxidation. The partial oxygen pressure, that's not enough to shed light on this. We need oxide degrowth kinetics. What I mean by oxide degrowth, we mean the regrowth of the growth of new oxide after an exfoliation event, because it does grow, but we don't know what rate right now. We're postulating a few things. And we would like to have, again, the last bullet here. I'm trying to see if I think the last bullet here up. We need to have good data on surface profile. This brings up the beyond 2D effort that will provide data on partial exfoliation events. So basically, you get like a topological data on the surface, morphology, dimples, and things like that to help us characterize how much exfoliation did we get. An MPL here was pointed out that coefficients of thermal expansions are very difficult to measure. There are limitations due to the instrument, there are limitations due to the sample preparation, there are limitations due to just the nature of the oxide itself. Micro cracks, defects that are affecting the measurement. And there are some needs. For example, this would be an ideal sample. Get an oxide scale that's 500 micron thick, 20 millimeters long. But it may not be. I'm pretty sure it's impossible. Another need is exfoliated area fraction correlations. In order to advance the blockage model, in order to have an idea about how much blockage area is expected, we need to have better correlations. We don't know yet how to correlate it with. So far, ARMIT has correlated with the energy in the strain energy in the oxide scale. But there may be other variables that we have to investigate. Again, I brought it up here. The surface profile will provide, I think, tremendous data on the exfoliated area at different times. And with that, the atlas and the database on morphologies and length scales of defects would shed light on the exfoliated length scales. And that brings me up to, concepts of effective strain energy. Right now, strain energies in the oxides are very well understood for monolithic, defect-free scales. We need to take into account the voids which are present within the scales or at the interfaces between the oxide scales, and that needs to be done. Multiple layer scales, because we show some data on the effect of different properties on the strain profile through oxide scales. And we saw that they're very different. We have different levels of strains in different oxide scales. Therefore, one single scale approach that considers just one uniform scale is not enough, because we're missing the minimum, the maximum strain levels, which can be in conjunction with failure criteria such as maximum void size. They will provide very good, accurate data for exfoliation. Also, we find out that we need to take into account, the strain variation. In terms of modeling needs, we need to incorporate the size distribution of voids, interfacial cracks. Those are weakening the interfaces. Therefore, the oxide scales can come off easier than it is through just a very solid interface between the oxide and the metal, or between the spinel and the magnetite. We need to take into account laminated structures, laminated scale structures, because, for example, for T22, you do have a banded structure of the spinel. But in order to do all of these, we need kinetics of void growth, coalescence, and the interaction between the voids, like Michael Schutze pointed out. And we need some data. All the time we need data for validation. That includes, samples from plants, again with the operating history. And also we need data for model development. Maybe some control experiments in which we can isolate some of the effects that we're looking at. And I mentioned we need properties, good properties too, and I think we're in a good path to get something over here. This concludes my presentation. So I guess what I would say for future work, I'll just refer to the second slide, in which we have to take a look at each of these aspects and shed some light on each of them.